Okay, so now that we have a basic understanding of, some simple ways to destroy sound, I really want to talk about the meat and potatoes of this entire course, which is generally the sound design, to be honest. But that kind of falls into the idea of not just the processing of how to make unconventional sounds, but really the mindset or the spirit. So I actually spent about 20 minutes going over this sound that I'm going to show you here in just a second, where I was doing it from scratch. But I guess I'll just do it again, which is totally fine. But what I wanted to talk about with this is that when it comes into glitch processing and whatnot, you really want to, instead of think about like what it is that I'm going to be doing over the next few minutes that I'm going to be showing you as a process, more so of taking the mindset about being like, oh, he's really just not trying to follow any rule and really just trying to build any kind of relationship that he, as in me, can to have effects interact with a signal, an incoming signal. When it comes into making glitching and stuff, there's really only kind of like one rule, which is how to shape the sound into a specific archetype towards the end of the chain. And what I mean by that is whenever you're using this in context, it's either going to become something that's percussive or short and hard or slow and evolving or techie, or which basically kind of comes down to envelopes. Right? If you got something with a long attack, it doesn't matter what that signal is. It's going to kind of appear as in something that's relatively ambient or, swelling of something of the sort. If it's, got a really short envelope, then it's going to be something that you might refer to as being percussive. And that's why it's so important to understand how envelopes kind of dictate the archetype of a sound in general. There are some caveats to that, of course, but just for the sake of, understanding this, once you know how to shape those envelopes, then really we're just shooting for timbre. That's really all it is, just shooting for timbre and movement. So it doesn't matter the pitch, it doesn't matter, what it is that you're doing. You really want to just say every rule that I know about like making conventional music, toss it out of the window and try to figure out different ways to, I guess, do the exact opposite. So I guess a great example of that would be, if you've got a bass, people would be like, oh, make sure you mono the low end at 120 hertz or whatever, and don't put reverb on it or this and that. Like, instead of doing that, be like, no, I'm going to drench this thing in reverb and I'm going to widen the low end, and then I'm going to use a crazy pitch shifter or something in which to like make it totally explode. That is what's going to take you much further than having a specific sound design recipe. But I wanted to tell you this because even though you will pick up a sense of direction just by doing this over and over again, I generally try not to think about what to do next until I'm ready to control the sound. And by that, I mean at the end of the chain, that's where you'll see something like a limiter, as you can see here, or you'll see a multi-band effect processor, or, some kind of compression or EQ or something of the sort. But up until that point, other than maybe having a limiter at the end to make sure that you don't blow your speakers out or your ears out, there really is no rules to it. And that really is the majority of the fun of making this genre as a whole. You could just be like, yo, I'm just going to throw some stuff together and then see what happens and hopefully make some cool sounds. So without further ado, this was what I made earlier for this video, but I guess I'll just start over from scratch and talk about the mindset behind this. But yeah, this is just a quick demo. Okay, so everything in this except for Pro L2 is from Bitwig first-party devices. So you don't have to have anything fancy. Normally, the easiest way for me to do this would be to show you in FacePlant, but excuse me, I wanted to talk about how to get this relationship with things in the first place, especially depending on what DAW you're in. So if you're in Ableton or Bitwig, you're in luck. If you are not in Ableton or Bitwig and you don't have Snap Heap, there's a couple of other things that you can use. For example, Infiltrator, boom libraries, I think it's like Outrage, or any kind of multi-effect processor that has some kind of modulator on it. And if you're really strapped and like there's just for whatever reason you're in like, who knows, you're in GarageBand or something, then you can always stack a bunch of effects and use automation. So when you do automation, don't be very precious with it. Literally figure out whatever the pen tool is. For in our case of Bitwig, it's 3, and just do this. because this is going to be extremely helpful, and it's going to help you keep moving as opposed to like trying to make sure that you're making the right choices and whatnot. Just let it fly is what I would say. If you take away anything from this video, let it fly. So that's really the mindset behind this and modulators and stuff. And really, I would say that between modulators and or automation, what's going to give you the most character of a sound is not even necessarily the effects themselves, but rather whether or not you are randomizing or you're creating envelopes that are smooth or in step mode. So for example, with all the modulators that I have nested within this godforsaken sound thing, all of these are steps or sample and hold. And so because of that, you're going to hear things kind of shifting a little bit more jagged, maybe not harsh, but it's going to be jagged movements as opposed to the stuff that sounds like it's like a life form or evolving organically, I guess. You can actually hear that there are some clicks in here, and that's as a result of all these effects kind of moving with each other. But because we're using this as a means to explore sound, like, again, don't worry about that. In fact, I think that in some cases that could be cool because it helps create a transient. Anywho, I digress. Let's go ahead and turn this off. I will actually leave this rack for anyone and everyone who, for one, watches this, but hopefully has Bitwig. But if not, that's okay too. So let's go ahead and actually just start with a couple of things here. I'm going to redo this from scratch. We're probably going to end up making something completely different, but that's good because, again, I don't really want you to care about like the formula. It's about the mindset of IDGAF. Really, if you can embrace that and just focus on trying to, you know, I guess like mix and match and really forge your own path, then you're actually going to figure out that like it's going to make you way better at sound design as a whole in general. So with that being said, I did cover this very lightly, but you will also like develop these skills as you make more of these, of like you'll figure out these combinations that have a particular characteristic. And the easiest example I could say is distortion and filtering, right? Like most people do that with bass. Why? Because it makes some kind of cool sounding movement, but then you add distortion after that to bring some of those lost frequencies back. And you're like, oh, I know what that sounds like now. Well, when you're doing all these combinations and stuff, you start with two simple things put together, and then you make it three things, and then four, and then five. And then you turn off other effects and play with the order of them. And suddenly you're starting to like figure out like, oh, that does that. Oh, that does that. And you'll remember that in your head, and that will help guide your intuition to make better sounding generators or better sounding glitch processing thingamagigawhopper, as one of my instructors would say. So yeah, there's a whole lot to discuss with this stuff. So I hope that you're having a coffee or something and geeking out, because these are the kinds of things that's really just hopefully going to be like, oh crap, I get it now. I get IDM now. Yes. So in any case, let's go ahead and continue with FM4. Yeah, it's just pretty much a sine wave. Now this matrix is pretty self-explanatory: 1 to 1, 2 to 1, 3 to 1, 4 to 1. These are representative of these oscillators, or rather operators here. So if you don't know what that means, just turn on the noise just a little bit and start plugging in numbers. Cool. So we've got something that's kind of aggressive, kind of bitey. Now, one thing that's really cool about this is that even though these are all technically sine waves, you can still control some of the movement of this with the mod. So what that means is we've got a bunch of stuff to play with on here to where we can start moving something on its own. And again, you can do this with automation if you want to, but unless if you absolutely have to, just do it this way. It's going to be a lot better. Now, with these modulators, I am going to set this to free, so that way it's constantly moving on its own. Otherwise, it's going to re-trigger at the same spot every time, which you might want, but that's not really the goal of what we're trying to do here. But that being said, now that I have this, something that I want to talk about is kind of exclusive to Bitwig, and that's the relationship between how to use modulators of effects. So what I mean by that is if I were to pull up something like a delay, you are going to notice that I can't actually modulate this. And so if you want to use this modulator on other effects, you need to nest the device by placing this in the effects, as now you'll see these kind of open up here. Now, I guess I picked this just off of a whim, so we can actually use this, but what I'm going to do is kind of copy this a couple of times and maybe like 2 or 3 times because we're going to need multiple ones of this. And I'm just going to mess with the mix per se, and then I will mess with the feedback on here. And the reason why is because whenever you change the time of this, if you've watched the last video, which if you haven't, I would actually pause the video and go back and check that out. Manipulating the time with this doesn't actually change the pitch much, so it's not all that interesting. However, we can use this as a means to create space and get into, just, I don't know, making something weird and wonky. So from here, let's go ahead and grab that third modulator here, and I'm going to set this to the pitch, and we're going to bring this up by, I don't know, say 14 semitones. It doesn't really matter. We're not really being deliberate with this. I can talk about that perhaps in a different video, to where like if you wanted to, you can just play with octaves, and that's where you would use something like an LFO, like a squarified LFO. But for this particular case, I want the pitch to be all over the place, because sometimes the way that the frequency, as in hertz value or kilohertz value or whatever, the harmonic value, even if you will, is going to heavily influence what it's going to sound like whenever you send that through. So as opposed to just having a single tone, I want this to be like just whatever all over the place. If you're doing this for bass or something, or for something melodic, it would make sense to maybe not do things that are dependent on changing the pitch, but we can talk about that another time. For this particular case, F it up. Right, already sounds like garbage. That's great. So what I'm going to do now is perhaps grab the blur. I really like using this thing because it's kind of like a slapback delay, but it just really messes things up. So maybe I'll grab a fourth one here, and I'm just going to go this one, maybe not all the way, but this one, and then D2, and then I'll grab a different modulator here and map this to D2 and D1, and this is on the left channel, this is on the right. Just really the mindset behind this is just pull up some stuff and just mess it up, but now this sounds like this. Let's go ahead and also toss that on the mix. That could be kind of cool. Sweet. So now we are going to grab an EQ plus. And I'm not sure if this has this or not. I think it does. Okay, it does. Great. So typically speaking, in the past, what I used to do was just modulate all these on their own. But what I have found a lot more success in, and a lot more efficiency of time in anyways, is to just create a weird and wonky shape, kind of like this, and then use the shift to kind of change everything around. I did actually do that in the last video, but that just kind of goes to show like why it's important to like be open to experimentation, because every time you do this, you want to try to do something completely different, unless if you're trying to make the same sound, but that's not really why we're here. So anyways, you're going to see this kind of jump around and hopefully create some cool vocal sounds because of the weird shapes that we have. Which is a great reminder to toss a limiter on here and make sure that we're kind of playing it safe a little bit, so that way we don't destroy our speakers or our ears. So yeah, let's go ahead and grab a pitch shifter now, just for funsies. And what I think we're going to do is actually use a independent modulator on this, or a couple rather. And what this is going to do is, one of these is going to mess with the grain here, and I'm going to set this to bipolar, set it to free. Doesn't really matter if you do or don't, it's just what I prefer. Then on this one, I'm going to have that jump around and be bipolar as well, set it to free. So now this is going to be doing some weird grainy stuff. Sounds pretty cool. Now, one thing that I think is going to be extremely helpful to this is we're going to have a dedicated modulator on here, or a dedicated randomizer rather, that is going to change the timing of all of these. And the reason why is because all of these are currently set to 1, which is at a quarter note, so everything is kind of just moving on a grid and on a beat, where I really just want this to be like absolutely decimated, if you will. So I'm going to set these here. This one goes up, this one goes down, this one goes at a slightly different value. This one can go at a slightly different value. But what this is going to do is really just change this of the timing of these in a way that's going to create unpredictable rhythms. Cool. Let's go ahead and grab a distortion. And what we're going to do is treat this like an overdrive as if it were an Ableton. And what I'm going to do on this is grab its own modulator as well. And again, like I said, these are just examples of like places to explore. There's no right or wrong with this. You really just kind of want to have fun with it. What I'm going to do is move all of these together so that way it looks like it's kind of like a bandpass, and maybe set this at like 50% or so and turn the drive up. But now this should create some interesting kind of like weird tonality. Okay, that's pretty cool. I'm going to move everything a little bit back though. So I'm going to close this up, move this down a little bit, and maybe move this down a little bit so that way it's centered. I'm really just kind of targeting the mid frequencies here. All right, now that sounds pretty cool if a little bit harsh, right? So one thing that we can do is grab a low pass filter, and I am going to try to grab one of these here that might maybe perhaps match the movement of this. So now that we have that, it's going to kind of bounce around at a weird and offsetting time as what this is. And maybe even I might want to move this before, since the distortion is meant to introduce harmonics. Cool. So I'm going to set this to be a little bit more. And maybe I'll even adjust this as well, just to see if this is going to give some cool like timbres and frequencies and stuff that is going to move around. Now it's not going to jump and do like the cool pitch thingy like I talked about in the delay video, but it's still going to go from having sounds that seem really close to sounds that kind of bleed out. And as you can hear, like we're getting tons and tons of different timbres that sound really cool. So let's keep going. I'm going to go ahead and add let's do a phaser, because I know that's going to be a little bit softer. But we're going to grab one of these bad boys. And really what the whole name of this game is just adding effects until you feel like you've got enough material to work with, or starting to play with the arrangement of these, or take a step back even if you feel like you need to, of being like, okay, there's way too many, I went too far. But it's kind of cool because I feel like this really encourages you to go another step if your CPU can handle it. You know, it really encourages you to be like, what else can this do? What else can we turn this into? And hopefully it takes away like the fear or the inhibition of being like, oh man, am I going too far? Or, you know, this is too much of this or too much of that. Like you need to figure that out. You need to figure out those boundaries so that way you have a better idea about how far you need to go in which to achieve a specific kind of sound. Now, one thing with this is that I hadn't really planned this, but we're getting some cool metallic textures. So now, like, I'm kind of gearing and aiming and hoping to find something to maybe kind of smooth it out a little bit and maybe make it a little bit more easy to ingest, because a lot of these sounds, of course, are really harsh. Okay, now I'm going to figure out which one this is mapped to. Here it is. And I'm actually going to set this to bipolar because this is only going up, and I also want it to go down. So let's see if we can kind of create like a happy medium between both going up and down. Pretty cool. So something else that you can do is you can kind of take this spread here and start to move this about if you wanted to. And what this pitch stacking is going to do is say, okay, well, we can have up to 12 voices. So I'm just going to set that to mono, but then I'm going to stack this by 4 and see if this is going to kind of spread itself out. Now I am kind of curious as to whether or not, oh, you can. So you can actually take the spread of this pitch and modulate that with a modulator, which is pretty sick. So let's go ahead and see what that's going to sound like. Now that we have all this stuff set up, it's really cool because you really don't have to do a whole lot else in order to like really break this to heck and heck. I mean, we've got 7 effects, I guess. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah, let's just say 7 effects. But what's really cool about this is that now that we have some of this stuff, we can actually like just copy these and move them across in different places, because at a certain point you're probably going to end up wanting to reach for the same stuff anyways. So what would happen if I took a pitch shifter here and maybe with these modulators I make them the complete opposite? But this is, again, part of the fun of this is that you're just saying, oh, well, what happens if I do this? Well, what happens if I do this? And I don't know whether or not this is going to sound cool. And that's why I enjoy doing this from time to time, because even though I've taught this a billion times, I'm constantly learning different combinations or constantly playing with different possibilities in which to get something that is somewhat interesting. So yeah, let's see what that sounds like. Let's move this over here. And again, just playing with different combinations, trying to see if I can find anything that's interesting. So we're getting some pretty lo-fi sounds, and I think that's mostly from the filtering and stuff, but even still, it doesn't matter, right? Because there's always more that you can do. And I mean, it's not that hard to maybe throw like an OTT over this or something just to see if that can bring back some of these harsh frequencies or whatever. Now, I will say that you can use the dynamics sort of ish to bring back some of these high-end frequencies and stuff, but what you want to do is you just want to turn the ratio down kind of like this and then turn the threshold down. You can see that this is going to push the volume of this up even higher. So you got to be really careful, especially if you're working with high-end content, but you can do some upwards compression. That is really the most important part about using an OTT anyways, but just keep in mind that this is only low and high. You can't do both upwards and downwards. You can do that within something like kilohertz dynamics or whatever, but there is no like true OTT that's built into Bitwig. Even still, OTT is free, the X4 Records version. So, I mean, if you're really keen on getting that, then just pick that up. But I'm going to turn the ratio up just a little bit. Yeah, that's a little bit harsh for me, so we're going to back off of that. Let's go ahead and add in maybe another filter here. And I know that I was talking about like hard or jagged sounds versus soft sounds, but there's no reason why you can't do a bit of both. So I believe that this is pretty smooth. There we go. And this is just a notch that's kind of going right here in the middle in between all this stuff. So let's just see if we can kind of fit that in between and get something interesting. I'm gonna move this over here. Let's go ahead and move this before the EQ plus. Now I'm going to grab another pitch shifter here. I guess I thought that I had created a duplicate of that, but apparently I hadn't. So let's go ahead and do exactly what I was talking about doing from beforehand, which was reversing this. And if you don't find something that's cool from all this work immediately off the bat, like, don't get discouraged. It's really imperative that like you have fun with this process, because it's not about reaching necessarily a specific destination, but rather just being like, oh, how does this sound? Oh, how does that sound? It should be an exploratory kind of process, so to speak. So maybe what we can even do is kind of pull back on some of the mods on these and see if that will kind of soften the sound in some cases or create something interesting. All right, that's pretty cool. Let's go ahead and grab one more effect, perhaps. We will just use the delay 1 here. And I am going to put this at full frequency range, and then we're going to use those modulators again to try to see if we can create some pitching or some jumping here, which unfortunately this will do this. But again, if you've watched my delay video from the last, I guess just the last video of the series or something, you'll know that this is kind of samey in the way that it moves. So you kind of have to throw some effects over it to mask what it's getting ready to do, because otherwise it would just sound like almost like DJ scratching, but much more harsh. So check this out, and then let's see if that gives us something any more or less interesting. Awesome. Yeah, I think this is super cool and definitely usable. Now, I have been recording 45-second intervals between all this. So now that I've got something I'm happy with, we can pull up that rolling sampler that I was talking about. Or the other thing that you can do is just set a resampling channel here to FM4, set that to post, set that to record, and turn the monitoring off. Again, turn the monitoring off. And you can kind of send this into this as a signal and begin recording. So I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to use the rolling sampler, but let's go ahead and get some cool sounds and just kind of drag that out into the timeline. Awesome. We can highlight all of this and just go whoop. And now we've got a bunch of different, I guess, textures and sounds in which to work with. So we can go ahead and save this preset as, I guess, IDM example 2 or something of the sort. IDM example 2. And then we can set this one as IDM example 1 per se. So I'm going to go ahead and turn that off, turn this one on. Save, maybe. Right click, save preset to library. IDM example 1 rather. And now we've got just something that's going to make a bunch of sound for us to like have some means of inspiration. And it doesn't really matter whether or not it is in key, because we're just looking for things that sound cool. These can be effects, these can be fills, these can be textures. I mean, it's very easy to click on this and just turn this into the beats mode, or like the preview onsets rather is what it's called. But let's be honest, it's it's beats mode, to just be like, oh, well, let's see if we can hear any cool little stutters or anything. You can also set this to something like slice mode and set this to none, and then you can set the rate to like 1/16 or something. This won't really make a big difference until you start pitching this. can see that from moving the audio warping into different modes and stuff, you'll end up getting some cool things. And then if you really want to, you can get like super fluous with it of double clicking here and going to the formant. And I believe that we've talked about this with audio editing, but you can hit the little 3 button and just go yata, right, and just go crazy until your heart's content, and then see what that sounds like, if anything. So now we'll click back on this, turn the format on. It will make a difference even if you have this off or on. It's just a matter of whether or not, I guess it says it's going to follow the pitch, so I'd encourage both. But I wonder if we can even, is that automatable? Okay, it's not, but that's okay, because we can always just duplicate this and have different things kind of alternate between this here. But what is cool is that we can kind of mess with this in between and play with this live and set up again that resampling channel, or just kind of duplicate this and then have it set as something different. So okay, so that's the first part of this. We're already getting stuff that we could definitely use for a means of creating some kind of like broken beat texture stuff. But one of the most significant things behind this is that we did use FM4 and put a lot of processing on this. But what's more important than this is this effect rack. So if you were to save and keep your effect racks and whatnot, then what we could do, and I'm not worried about keeping this, is you could essentially pull up something from any other synth, say something like Faceplant, and, you know, just, I don't know, pull up some kind of bass or something. I think that's just going to be the most efficient way to do this. So I'll pull up a bass that I made, and sure, that one works. Just turn all of these guys off and just use this as an impulse or something in which to create cool and different and hopefully exciting variations and effects too. Okay, we can kind of flip through this. So I think that you get the point. But the other thing too is like you don't have to send basses through this. You could also do like chords or something if you wanted to. So we could have something like this, and let's say I'm just going to move up a couple of octaves, and I'm just going to play a 7th chord now. Actually, let me show you on the keyboard so you can see what I'm playing. Sometimes that will give you something that will sound completely different. That's kind of cool. So let's go ahead and give that a release. Right, just different things to mess with. And I know that this sounds kind of hollow and lo-fi right now, but that's just a consequence of the choice that we had. But even still, you can always go back and pull off of stuff or add more things if you wanted to. It's just important to kind of understand, like, again, the mindset behind this of breaking sound. And you're going to stumble upon some gold. You're going to stumble upon a lot of garbage. But I guarantee that if you save this rack, you could only be 1 or 2 effects away from this being completely different, or just some small parameter. And that's really where the mastery comes in. And that's why I think that it's going to be hard for people to replicate my Eternum series, is because it becomes a point where it's not just about the effects anymore. It's about controlling the taste, but that's what you have to develop for yourself. Even still, saving these racks can be incredibly helpful because you can use them on other sounds, or if you have a combination of something like a bunch of effect racks and your computer can handle it, then what you can do is start to really just stack these to your heart's content. So this is just one that I made recently, and I can turn the mix on from this, and this is kind of the same process to where these things are just kind of going ham. But now if I play, you know, maybe that same chord, let's see what happens. I'm going to go ahead and grab another limiter here. Alright, that sounds pretty cool. Now, what would happen if I move this before the other effect layer? And these are the kinds of things that you really are trying to open yourself up to, is like not just getting conformed to a single processing chain, more so of a sense of like, yo, I'm going to try this, I'm going to try this. Oh, play Goldilocks. What happens if I do this? This board is too hot, this board is too cold. Find the one that's just right. Alright, now it's getting louder, so I'm going to go ahead and turn that back down. But you can see here that we're getting different results just by switching the arrangement of effects around. Now I will say that generally the last effect that you have, sans the control line of effects that you have, are generally what's going to have the biggest impact. So for example, if I were to throw a ring mod on this, this would be the most prominent effect because it's last on the chain. So this is already on right now, but you're going to notice that this is going to start giving a chopper / helicopter feel to it, just because this is my default preset. But check this out. So you can hear it speeding up and slowing down and kind of oscillating, or I guess beating or vibrating at a particular frequency that's ever changing. But that's because this is, again, the last effect of the chain. So it's really important that like you remember that, just as a means of like, if something sounds too much of something, usually it's the last effect that you have going through it, but then forget about it and just keep going until you find something that you deem interesting. So from a usability standpoint, what I would do is really just take the time to listen through some of these sounds and don't be in such a rush. I would say try not to record like 10 minutes of footage of sounds of loops, because you're going to get desensitized to it extremely fast, especially because these generally are relatively atonal. Now, that's not to say that you can't find something tonal and perhaps throw it into a sampler or so. So for example, you know, this little thing has some kind of tone into it. So if I were to throw that into its own deal here, kind of like so, and try to play a pitch or something. 1 second, I need to move this into an instrument rack. You know, this could be a cool little pluck thing, and you can kind of create different instruments and stuff out of that. Which is actually pretty cool. If you wanted to find the frequency or the fundamental of where this lies at, just open up a ProQ, any kind of parametric EQ, and hit a C, and try to find where the most prominent frequency is. In this case, it's looking like it's relatively close to an E, E minus 50. You can try to be slick. It doesn't usually work, but if you right click and go detect root key, sometimes it will work. In this case, it did not, but I'm going to go into D#2, or rather E, and I'm going to turn this down by 50 cents because it's not quite even. But let's see if we can get closer in the ballpark to this playing a C now. Let's see what this is. It's B. So it's not perfect, but it's relatively in that ballpark. So now that you have that, it's relatively tuned. There is some charm to it not being in key or not being perfectly tuned as well. So just kind of keep that in mind. But if you're looking to kind of play something, the other thing that you can do is you can set this to loop mode and change this here into something of the sort that's kind of like this. And now this has a much more definable pitch, which is, that's playing at B5 plus 33, plus 28, something so to speak. So if we were to set this to B, maybe a little bit here, like plus 28-ish, then we might be able to get a little bit closer to that C. Well, now that's playing an F. So even still, from here, what you're trying to do is just isolate that and figure out what frequency that is. And as long as you know what it is that you're playing, then you're going to be able to figure that out. I could spend a lot of time on this, but that's generally the approach. And if it's not discernible, so let's say this is just super like harmonic in that way, then you can actually impose a specific frequency onto this. And I would say do that beforehand. So if you take this little piece and you throw like a Pro Q on here, and now we're just getting into like sound design tricks and stuff, but if I were to play this and take a frequency here and say, okay, I really want this to have a high frequency at F2. Okay, well, you can see that there's not really that many frequencies here, but let's go ahead and take this one. That's at G, I believe, G5. Now, if I were to throw, or bounce this out rather, and throw that into the sampler, then it should be pretty easy to find that G5. So if I go here to G5, or any, I guess, octave of G, and I hit that C, there we go. Now we're much closer in the ballpark of what we're looking for. So you can artificially tune things to your advantage, which can sometimes be pretty cool, but just be careful about how resonant you make stuff. But yeah, that's something that I actually do a lot with drums. If I'm like, yo, I can't tell what pitch this is, but I really want it to be XYZ or something, then that's a great way to kind of stumble upon that. And again, it's just a matter of finagling with it and showing the process of like trial and error. But even still within the sampler, you know, you can do a bunch of different things. You can set it to texture mode if you wanted to, and set this to like freeze. And then you go, oh, okay, well, that's kind of cool. Well, what happens if I come back over here and I'm like, oh, well, maybe I can just, you know, grab this little rack like this and hit copy, and then come on over here and hit that little pasty and make sure that that limiter is on here. More importantly than anything, just turn that bad boy down, because we never know how that's going to sound. And suddenly we're able to continue to apply all these sounds with the same effect racks. Maybe this sounds really cool, but I still want to preserve some of the original character. Well, thankfully there's a mix knob here, so we can kind of just be like, all right, well, I don't want the whole thing. And then honestly, you can get into, you know, modulating all the parameters within here. You can actually modulate between repitch cycles and textures if you wanted to, but you have to retrigger the MIDI, even though that's kind of arbitrary because we're not really trying to track or record anything. We're just trying to make sounds in general. But hopefully this will give you some insight into like so many different methods that you can break sound. But what I will say to kind of wrap things up is like really invest your time into effect processing and randomization, at least at the beginning stage. So that way you can apply it to a wide range of sounds that you already have access to, especially if you have a sample pack or you got some presets on hand. That way you will find so many happy accidents, especially if you're not really like having any expectations other than trying to break stuff. The other most important thing that I can say about this is no matter what you do, put a limiter at the end of your chain. I'm going to say that of the utmost importance, especially if you're manipulating delays. Whatever you do, put a limiter at the end of your chain, sometimes multiple limiters, because delays sometimes ignore the output signal. So your limiter will think that you're hitting it and capping it at 0, but because of the way that amplitude stacks and the way that it's coming out of the speaker, it'll actually be significantly louder. So please protect your ears. I have tinnitus. I don't know if it's from some kind of hearing loss of listening to loud sounds. I try to be extremely careful anyways, but I do have tinnitus and it sucks. And you definitely don't want to self-impose that on yourself. So speaking of, I think that I'm actually going to leave you with one more video since we're kind of encompassing, or sorry, one more trick since we're encompassing all this stuff. And that is sending and routing stuff into an effects chain and creating some kind of like super delay thing. You thought this video was over. Nah, man, we're doing all the cool things in this. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create another effect chain. So I think it's Option Command T that I have. It is. Now what's really cool about this, if you look here, and you got to be so careful with this, but even still, like if you do it right, you can get some really cool stuff. But you can actually loop this feedback stuff into themselves. How cool is that? So I can be like, all right, I'm going to send this back into effects 1, and then this effects 1 is going to go into effects 2. So now there's just this constant loop of stuff. Now what I'm going to do just in case is I am going to put limiters on both of these, and I am actually just going to turn this down significantly because I don't know how this is going to sound. Now the next piece of this is I'm going to send a return channel from this little device into these guys, and basically I'm just sending a return track or creating a bus or whatever. But because you have the ability to do feedback with these buses and stuff, it's a really cool and relatively uncharted territory as a means of like this kind of effect processing and whatnot, or at least as far as I know. But again, just be careful, be careful, be careful. So yeah, now that I have that, I can send an impulse through this with this effect layer or whatever, and these should start to create some weird feedback. So let's see what that does. Right, cool. So from here, if you were to maybe, do something absolutely insane, like copy this into this, yes, into this, then make sure that the limiter is on the end of all of these. Then we can kind of see if we can get something else that's relatively interesting. But I'm going to go into all of these and turn the mix on and just see if I can get something other than a buzz. So now I'm going to grab a delay, and again, this kind of just is the repeating rabbit hole about like how deep and stuff you can get in with this, but it's really just a matter about being like, oh, well, I did a bunch of stuff, but like, don't be afraid to keep going. Don't be afraid to like just get super duper deep. There will be a point, at least for me, where I'm like, I'm just looking for the most efficient way to do things, but just as a means of exploration, that might not be like your desire. You might just want to geek out on sound design and stuff, and there's a place for everybody, especially within Bitwig. But yeah, I'm just going to have this delay here, and I'm going to see if this is going to create an infinite feedback loop. There we go. Okay, this is the part where you want to turn this down. Because now that you're starting to create these kinds of things, this is where it can get super duper loud. So you got to be really careful when you start doing this kind of thing. And what you can do is just begin playing with some of these knobs here and seeing if you can manipulate them to get different stuff. I'm going to turn on a snap heap rack and see if I can get that to switch up a little bit. I don't really know what's going to happen, but that's kind of part of this as well, is just being like, all right, well, let's see if we can stick a move and make something interesting with this. Now, for whatever reason, if this is becoming too insane, turn the feedback off on all of these and restart. Great, so now you can kind of move back off of these. Unfortunately, you can't modulate these. It would be super awesome if you could, but now we can kind of reset this and get ready for a different kind of feedback loop and see if we can get something interesting. So it's kind of going on its own right now. I'm not hitting any keys. But I am just slowly trying to turn things and kind of let it keep going and whatnot. But I just wanted to introduce you to this concept because this is something that a lot of people do, especially in like modular environments and whatnot. But again, you got to be very meticulous with this and very careful. And if done right, especially if you start playing with reverbs and delays and stuff, just with an infinite amount of feedback, you can get some really cool stuff. But again, just be careful. So yeah, now that we've covered audio editing, we've covered basic intro to creating glitches and stuff, and then we've also talked about just how to do like super effect processing. The only thing that's left to do now is maybe just find an approach to some sounds that are going to seem interesting to kind of collect together. And then we ended up making a cool little like arbitrary glitch collage of these until we have a main section. And then from there, we really just start arranging a tune. Now, in the next video, I think that we're going to cover some melodic approaches to how to get really just well, I guess we'll do something with melody and then break the melody into means that will still be usable and recognizable. But it's kind of the same stuff, just as a means of being more meticulous and careful with the effects that we use to where it doesn't ruin the pitch so much. But once we have something like that, heck, we can even just like bounce out a chord progression or something and cut the audio up. It's really easy to write a tune from there. And when it comes to glitch stuff, if you want to go like the hyper glitch route, you really want to focus on texture over melodic elements. Whereas if you want to do like a traditional IDM tune, you focus on like creating something that's musical from the get-go. And that's not to say that they can't exist in the same space. I'm just kind of letting you know how to like get a different approach in between the two. So hopefully that was helpful. Be sure to give me any feedback if you have any, but this was super fun to make and hopefully you had a good time watching this stuff, and let me know if you have any questions, okay? I will see you guys in the next video for melodic stuff.